Start recording. Okay, we are going to talk about disadvantages tonight. Much like my lecture yesterday, if you have questions, you're welcome to type them in the chat or just click the whatever the raise hand button is, and we will get there. So since this is the more advanced lecture on disadvantages, we're not going to go over like, you know, what are the parts of the disad or like really basic things like that. What we're going to do is we'll briefly talk about kind of what the purpose of a disadvantage is, and then we'll go speech by speech how they work on the negative, speech by speech what the affirmative does when answering them, kind of the strategy for thinking about those things, and then I'll talk about what I think are likely disadvantages this year, although I will just go ahead and blanket say that the disad ground this year is not great. So that's kind of disappointing, but it's okay. So disadvantages. Quick reminder about this. They are really a negative effect of the plan. There is something bad that happens as a result of the affirmative. Remember, we talked about this yesterday with my lecture, that the point is to, the negative's point is to prove that the app is worse than the status quo or a competitive advocacy, right? The next job is twofold. One, prove the app solution is bad. Two, prove the app solution or the app problem doesn't matter. And so the disad proves that the app is worse than the status quo or a competitive advocacy. And I want to say that at first because it's oftentimes, I think we forget that in kind of the weeds of the cases of disadvantages and then kind of miss the big purpose of how we're thinking about disads. So keep that in mind as you're debating the DA and as we go about here. In terms of putting together the DA and the 1NC, the first thing I want to talk about is in terms of uniqueness. I think it's really important to remember that recency does actually matter a lot, right? Your card needs to describe how the world is actually working right now. And ideally, it should start to at least hint at answering some of the other concerns that may come up. So for example, I just cannot imagine, if I were still debating, reading any uniqueness card that does not address coronavirus or does not at least start to answer coronavirus, because no matter what your disadvantage is, no matter what your argument is, somebody out there has written an article that says that coronavirus just messes everything up, right? So this is true, especially for politics and for elections, right? That coronavirus is like it. That's the big thing that people are focusing on. It's true with the cartels arguments, which people, at least in my lab, have started debating about. It's true in terms of thinking about the likelihood of crime or the likelihood of police to be, I don't know, deployed or effective, et cetera, right? So when you are finding uniqueness cards, and I think this has to start in the 1NC, not in the block, and I'll get to that in a second. You want to have them start to answer some of the things that the affirmative is going to say in response. And in particular, given how big of a deal coronavirus is, I think it's got to answer coronavirus. You know, it may not be like the most explicit answer ever, but it's got to at least take coronavirus into account. You've got to be able to look at the other team and at least say, yeah, our uniqueness card does answer coronavirus to some extent. Okay, so I think that's an important thing to think about for uniqueness cards for the 1NC. In terms of the link card, you want to be, the more specific, the better, obviously. I think we all know that. But I think it's important to start this from the 1NC and to immediately start out being as specific as you can. Because ultimately, like, generic cards are only going to get you oh so far, or like link cards that are about the topic, I should say, are only going to get you oh so far, right? If you read a card that's just blanket, like criminal justice reform would radically change how the election works, but the affirmative is just like this itty bitty tiny af about, I don't know, policing on native reservations, then it becomes so much easier for the affirmative to stand up and be like, yeah, but we're not that criminal justice reform that your evidence is talking about. And so in that instance, the response to that has to be reading new cards, right? The block's job has to be, okay, we got to try and figure out what cards do we have that do actually make the DA link to the affirmative. And so my thought is really just, you might as well start that from the 1NC, right? You know that the 2AC is going to try and wiggle out of the link. You might as well try and start from the 1NC to be as specific as you So obviously sometimes we have to rely on generic cards. You can't possibly have a link to every single affirmative that could possibly be read. But assuming that you have the specific card, read it in the 1NC. In terms of thinking about internal links, the purpose of an internal link really is to kind of tell the story of a disadvantage. Ideally, you would have fewer internal links to your disad, because the more internal links you have, there are more places that the affirmative can kind of poke holes in your DA. It becomes a lot easier for the app to look at it and say, yeah, well, this little piece of your disadvantage doesn't make sense, therefore the whole thing goes away, right? Because remember, the weird thing about being negative is that with a disadvantage, with any off-case argument really, if the affirmative beats back just one piece of that off-case argument, then the entire argument goes away. So if you have like 4 or 5 different internal links to your DA, if the app beats back just one of those, your entire disadvantage story goes away. So I think it's better to have fewer internal links if you can than it is to have more internal links. That being said, if you need to have more internal links in order for the disad to make any sense at all, then read the internal links, obviously make the disadvantage make sense. But generally, the better disadvantages are going to have fewer internal links. And part of why I mentioned this, and I think it's important to think about, is because there seems to be this weird trend I've noticed in high school debate lately for debaters to read disads that are like 7 to 8 cards long in the 1NC with 4 or 5 different internal links, when they could just be so much simpler. I watched this last year with a Sadi Prolip disad where a team read I don't know, it was a 7 or 8 card 1NC shell, and it's a Sadi Prolip DA. You can get that out there in 2 cards and make things way simpler. So my point is just I don't think you should do that. Keep your things simple, keep your disad story simple so that you can explain it easily, and then you can more tightly package your arguments so that the affirmative is less able to poke holes at some of the weaker points involved in your DA. And then in terms of thinking about the 1NC impact card, obviously why things matter. Recency still matters here, again, especially in terms of the coronavirus. Corona just so royally messes everything up, as proven by the fact that we're online. That to some extent, it would be great if your impact card could also take into account coronavirus. I think that is less likely and less easy to do than it is with your uniqueness arguments, but it would be great if you could have it if possible. It's also, I think, the best impact cards will have kind of a built-in turns case component, so you can more easily explain that in the block. So one of the things that I really like about the elections disadvantage that we have here is that it is that 1NC impact card does list out a whole bunch of different terrible things that a Trump 2020 presidency would cause. And so it becomes a lot easier than for the negative to stand up in the block and say, okay, well, the AF claims to solve this thing, but our piece of 1NC evidence says, actually, if Trump wins the election, he's going to mess all that up anyways, which means you can't solve it. And I think it's valuable to have that, especially because there are a whole bunch of judges who think that you need to have, or are kind of sticklers about saying you need to have a card in order to make those kinds of arguments. So then you can point at this and be like, look, I do have a card. I don't need to read another one in the block. It's fine. So that's kind of what I think about building disads for 1NC is for uniqueness card, recency really matters. Ideally, you wanted to start answering some of the thumper arguments that the 2AC is inevitably going to say, especially in terms of coronavirus. Link card, make it specific. Internal link, try and limit them, but still make your disad make sense. And then your impact card, again, try and make it more recent, and also try and make sure that your card has a built-in turns case component. And really, all of those suggestions are designed not to make your 1NC easier, but rather to make your block and your 2 and R easier, because, and we'll get to this in just a second, but the 2 and R's job is to close all the doors. And so the 2 and R really needs to be able to look at the judge, look at the other team, and be like, look, we have all of these pieces of evidence that answer all of these possible arguments that the other team could say in the last speech. And if you start that in the first speech, then it allows you to kind of patch those holes easier as you go along. Basically, what I'm trying to say is people all the time will miss little different technical things that other teams are saying, especially with the negative against like tricky 2As. And so it becomes easy, it becomes possible for the affirmative to stand up and say, no, actually, we have this, cool nuance that your generic pieces of evidence didn't answer. And then you can stand up and say, or you may like have this moment in prep time, you're like, crap, they're right. I totally didn't realize that was what they were saying. But then you can go back and look at your card and be like, actually, no, my card did answer this argument. Here's why it does answer it. And so I think it's good to start with as specific as you can, and then obviously stay more specific as you go along. So that's how I think the 1 and C should work. In terms of the block, usually disadvantages end up in the 1 and R in the block. And I think that's true for 2 reasons. Number 1 is that it allows usually the 1 and R takes one self-contained position. And by that, I mean they will talk about it for 5 whole minutes. That's not always the case. And if that's not your strategy, it's not the end of the world. But generally, that's how 1 and Rs work. And so it makes a lot of sense to put the disadvantage there because it allows that 1 and R to just kind of wax poetics about it and just totally crush it. And make things a lot more difficult for the 1 and R. It also, number 2, I guess, is that it allows you to avoid cross-X, which is really nice because truthfully, most disadvantages are pretty silly. And we'll talk about this a little bit more towards the end, but yeah, I mean, like, most dissets don't actually make a lot of sense if you really, really think about them, and cross-examination is a really easy place for people to poke holes in arguments because it's more conversational, it's a lot more kind of connected between yourself and your judge, right? You're having more of a conversation with your judge as opposed to speaking at them like you would in a speech. And so there is kind of that 1 and R strategy of let's put the disadvantage in the 1 and R so the other team can't ask questions about it, which is, legit and maybe sometimes something that you should think about if your disadvantage is particularly silly or something that, you're kind of like, how do we know about this one? So how this ends up working out or how it gets deployed, I guess, for the 5 minutes in the 1 and R is generally, people will start with a short impact overview where they do impact calculus and talk about why the disad turns the case. Keyword here being impact overview, right? The point of this overview is not to like walk me through all of the parts of the disadvantage. Like I as your judge am capable of flowing. I know what you've said. So you don't need to like re-explain the story of the DA. The idea is just to talk about the impact. And people oftentimes start here because the impact is the most important part of the disadvantage, right? You need to have offense, you need to have a reason why the app is a bad idea. If the app causes nuclear war or extinction from some other capacity, that means the app's probably a bad idea. Sorry, so that's usually why people start here. So if you are going to do an overview on the disad, make sure it's just about the impact. Now, I personally, and I won't lie to you all, my opinion is in the minority, but I think I'm right, so whatever. Think that there should just be no overviews and I think that in 99.99% of the case always, because overviews themselves are bad for debate. And I can ramble about that at some other point in time. But realistically, I know that you're all going to do overviews anyways. So my advice about the overview is to keep it short. Keep it short. You want it to be probably about 30 seconds or less. So again, remember, you're just explaining your impact, you're doing turns case. So it should be really quick. If you have an overview, that is. And then the rest of the 1 and R should just be line by line. And the way that you want to think about this when you're line by lining against the 2AC is you should always follow what's called the rule of 3. Or if you're into math, which I'm not, 2x plus 1, where x represents the amount of arguments that the affirmative says on something. So if the affirmative read 1 non-unique card against you, then you in the 1 and R should have 3 responses to that. So you'd extend your 1 and C card and then read at least 2 new cards. The way that disadvantages oftentimes end up coming down or going down, I guess, is they become massive card wars. And I think that's a good thing. I'm not trying to say that's bad or anything because, the idea is that it's a debate between way policy debate works is that it's evidence-based, right? We rely on our experts, et cetera. And so the more experts, the more qualified experts we have suggesting something, the more valuable. So you should be prioritizing reading cards, particularly in the block. If you, as the negative, are not just dramatically burying the 1AR in cards, then you are not doing your job. So I think at minimum, your goal should be to read 20 cards on the disadvantage in the block. Yes, I did say 20. This means that you need to highlight your evidence effectively and do speaking drills so you can try and get a little bit faster and clearer. Remember, clarity matters too. But read lots of cards in the block is basically what I'm saying. Obviously, don't forget to do analytics. That matters too, but read cards in the block. The way that you want to go about literally doing line by line when you are answering a 2AC argument is as follows. You want to say, they say X, whatever it is that they're saying, but claim, warrant, author, impact, evidence comparison, read more cards. So I'll repeat that and then kind of unpack that a little bit. So they say whatever it is that they're saying, but claim, warrant, author, impact, evidence comparison, read more evidence. So they say X, whatever it is that they've said in the 2AC, but here's our claim, here's why we think they're wrong, here's the warrant for why they're wrong, here's the piece of evidence that I'm referencing that we've read in the 1 and C that forwards this argument for us. That's the author component. And then the impact component is telling the judge why things matter, right? Because oftentimes when we don't have this, people get lost. People will, I see this happen all the time in debates where people will just wax poetics on an argument and then I'll look at the map of debate and be like, I have no idea why that mattered. So the purpose of impacting here is to say, not impacting in the sense of this means they caused nuclear war, but rather, what does this mean for the debate writ large? What does this mean for how the judge should be thinking about things or thinking about this particular argument? And then do some evidence comparison, right? Because again, we're at an evidence-based form of debate where, the affirmative's read a card, you've already read a card in the 1 and C, right? Compare those cards, explain why your evidence is better. And that can go in a bunch of different ways, right? You might have a more qualified author, your evidence might be more recent, you might, I don't know, take into account some events that their evidence wasn't taken into account, whatever, but do some kind of evidence comparison here, and then read more cards. So I really think that's how all line by line period works, but it's especially true in terms of the disadvantage because it's such a technical position. So I will say that one more time because I might have said that a little bit too quickly. When you are doing line by line on a disadvantage in the block, here's how you go about doing it. First, they say X. What is the thing they've said? Second, but here's our counterclaim. Third, here's our warrant. Fourth, here's the author, the piece of evidence that we read in the 1 and C that answers this, or that makes this argument for us. Fifth, here's my impacting of it. Here's why it matters for the debate. Sixth, here's some evidence comparison. Here's why you should prefer my evidence over their evidence. Seventh, here are the more cards that I'm going to read. So that's how line by lining in the block should work, especially in terms of the DA. So to kind of recap that section, the 1NR generally will take the disadvantage. The idea is that it's a more self-contained position. It's easier for the 1NR to talk about it for all 5 minutes. It lets you avoid cross-ex, which is nice because truthfully, most disouts are silly and can kind of be taken apart like that. This usually starts with a short impact overview that's about 30 seconds long. I ideally think there shouldn't be overviews. You should just do that all of that on the line by line, but I know you're all going to ignore me and do overviews anyway, so seriously keep them short because doing line by line is incredibly important, especially in terms of the disadvantage. And then when you get to the line by line, make sure that you're doing it in that fashion that I said, and that you're reading just a whole bunch of cards. In terms of the disadvantage deployment in the 2NR, so there's really 5 different possible 2NRs involving the disab, depending on how you want to emphasize things. And that emphasis comes down to what your strategy is. So the 5 different, I think, 2NRs involving DA is number 1, we've got the disadvantage in case. Number 2, disadvantage and the counter plan. Number 3, counter plan and the disadvantage. And yes, those things are different, right? So number 2 is DA and counter plan. Number 3 is CP and DA. Number 4 is DA counter plan case. Number 5 is counter plan DA case. And the logic of why number 2, number 3, and then number 4, number 5 are different from each other is because it's about emphasis and it's about the focal point of the 2&R, right? So if you think that your 2&R is going to prioritize the disadvantage, right? You're going to go primarily for an offensive strategy, i.e. the app is bad, right? It causes this disad, and so it's a terrible idea. Then you want to start with the disad because you always want to start with the major thing that you're going to win here, right? You want to start with your offense, generally speaking. Versus the flip of that, the counterplan DA strategy is a much more defensive strategy whereas instead of just this big push on the app is always bad, your push has been instead, here we've got this other option. It so clearly solves everything that the affirmative could ever want to solve that maybe there's a chance that the affirmative is a bad idea because of this disadvantage. Right, and so it's a difference in emphasis, right? It's either the kind of offensive 2&R strategy or that defensive 2&R strategy. I will say that I think I think there's kind of a large trend towards the counterplan DA focus as opposed to the DA counterplan focus. I could be wrong about that. This is mostly just from my personal experience, but I think that trend is okay. I'm not saying that it's a bad one. It's just really one that you need to think about when you're thinking about how you want to give the 2&R in each individual debate, because a DA counterplan strategy is not the same thing as a counterplan DA strategy. All that being said, I will say that given this topic, that the DA links are just not great, truthfully. I think that your 2&R most of the time should have a counterplan. And so I think the first strategy that I said, this disad plus case strategy, is one that is not going to be terribly effective this year. But I do think that there are a whole bunch of counterplans that are pretty effective this year, but I won't ramble about that too much because Mahoney's going to go into that more tomorrow. But yeah, so probably you need the counterplan of the 2&R. But what that emphasis is matters a lot for you, depends on what your strategy is. Okay, the disad counterplan case or counterplan disad case strategies are they're usually a bit more kind of a run and gun kind of thing, right? Usually your counterplan is going to cover what the case covers, and so how you split that emphasis becomes obviously drastically more difficult. You still can give this 2&R where you're primarily focusing on the disadvantage and then you kind of just have the counterplanning case as an afterthought, or you could give this 2&R where the disadvantage is an afterthought, but it is difficult. So I think the easier strategies to deploy on this topic is either DA plus counterplan or counterplan plus DA. But the thing that you really, really need to think about in the 2&R is that the 2A that you are debating, this 2AR is always going to cheat. It's just how 2As work, and it's just 2ARs always cheat because they're always going to lie and say, you know, we had this great argument that was totally here earlier in the debate, and it's like, no, it wasn't actually there, but it's just going to happen. So your job as the 2&R is to preempt that and stop that from occurring, right? This is especially true with the disad case, because the 2A always, always, always wants to talk about how important and how strong and how awesome their case is, right? And they're going to weigh the risk of that impact against yours. So you need to think about how you're going to go about beating that. So really when I was talking about kind of the 5 possible 2&R strategies, the way you want to orient that is around what do I think the 2AR is going to do and how do I think I'm going to answer that before the 2AR already does this. Okay. So Max in the chat has asked, how should we split the time in the 2&R? DA, should we say we go DA counterblend? Should we do like 3-to-1? There's not like a absolute rule for how you do split that time. That is going to be determined based on what you want to emphasize, what the 1AR has done, how good your evidence is, how many cards you have versus how many cards the affirmative has, your judge, What do you think the 2AR is going to do? There's just a whole bunch of different factors that mean that I cannot give you a, yes, you have to split your time exactly like this every time kind of thing. But the kind of general rule that I'm trying to stress to you all is that you should pick one of these things to prioritize, either the disad or the counter plan if you have both of them in the 2NR, depending on which 2NR strategy you kind of pick. Are there other questions about things we've said so far? Everything makes sense? Okay. Cool. So let's talk for a little bit about being AF against disadvantages. The 2AC against the disadvantage should always have at least 6 components, sometimes 7, depending on what your strategy is. But I think the 2AC should always start with a case outweighs component. Just the affirmative is more important than the disadvantage. And the idea is that if all else fails, you want to be able to prove that your affirmative is just more important, right? Remember, your job as the AF is to say, here's a problem with the world, here's how we solve it. The disadvantage is to say that you actually cause more problems, right? It could both be true that the affirmative resolves some problem in the world and also causes something bad, right? Something different probably, but it's possible. And so you could, as the affirmative, win with just a case outweighs argument. It is very difficult, don't get me wrong, but it is possible. And given that you as the 2A have presumably written your affirmative, it's basically your baby, you want to protect that AF, right? You want to say that your AF is awesome, that it's super important, that the impacts you're talking about really matter. And so explaining why the case outweighs should be a much easier thing for you to do in the 2AR. And so I think starting with that in the 2AC sets you up well to go for that, to at least include a case outweighs component in the 2AR, which you obviously need to have because impact calculus matters a lot, right? So I think the 2AC should always start with case outweighs. Number 2 is the 2AC should have some impact defense. I think this is the second thing that you should say because, again, impacts are the most important pieces of individual arguments in debate. It's what we're really weighing at the end of a round as a judge. And so having that early on matters. Number 3 is have either your link turn or your impact turn, i.e. what's your piece of offense. That's what's your piece of offense internal to the disadvantage as opposed to external to the disadvantage, right? Your external thing is this case outweighs thing. Internal thing is either a link turn or an impact turn. Obviously do not have both because you should not double turn yourself. But having just a link turn or an impact turn, I think that should be the third component because it's offensive. 4th is the internal link takeout. And I think that this should go here because I kind of said this before, most internal links are pretty silly on disadvantages. Like, truthfully, the idea that if the federal government were to enact some policing reforms, then the entire election would just drastically change, and that's the reason why Trump would win. It's just like so incredibly silly that making that internal link argument is pretty persuasive, I think. And so I think it's I think that goes as number 4. That's your first kind of, what am I trying to say? It's not your first defensive argument, but it's more important, I think, than uniqueness or link defense is what I'm trying to say. So I put the internal link take out here as number 4. Number 5, I think uniqueness take out. I think that this one goes here because uniqueness is always probable, right? It's never a kind of like yes, no thing, which truthfully everything is probable because we're always thinking in terms of risk, but this is more true of uniqueness than it is of like a link argument or an impact argument because the world is constantly changing all the time. Again, this is why we need to have new cards for our uniqueness stuff. Number 6, link defense. I think this is generally, not always, one of the weaker arguments for the affirmative to forward against a disadvantage because a lot of times whatever the affirmative does, a lot of times the way that the links are written is such that they are talking about the thing that the affirmative does, right? If the negative's done their job and read a specific link argument in the 1NC, i.e. they read a card about the AF as opposed to the topic itself, then winning link defense becomes more difficult, is what I'm saying. And then the last thing that 2ACs can have, which oftentimes they will not, is an add-on, which is just kind of like a mini advantage. It's just another argument that you can use to weigh against the DA, another reason that the affirmative outweighs. Add-ons are not terribly common, and if you feel like you're slow or you're debating a really big 1NC, I wouldn't prioritize it because you need to make sure you're answering everything, and they open up a whole bunch of other possible problems that I don't really want to get into right now, but it is a possibility to read against the DA. So the 2AC, I think, needs to have at minimum those 6 components and then occasionally has a 7th one. So number 1, case outweighs. Number 2, impact defense. 3 is your link turn or your impact turn, not both. 4, your internal link takeout. 5, uniqueness takeout. 6, link defense. 7, maybe an add-on. I think in that order in particular. Someone has asked me, can links connect enough with the impact to not require an internal link? Yes, that is possible. And I think the best disadvantages will have that. But that is obviously not true of all disadvantages. Oftentimes disadvantages do need internal links. And so, you know, we need to be thinking about those things. Okay, in terms of 1AR strategy against the disad. I think you always want to start with a case outweighs argument / answering their turns case argument. Again, this is part of why I think you start with the case outweighs argument in the 2AC, is again because you want to be able to prove that the affirmative is just at base level more important than the disadvantage, more important than what they're talking about. And then you want to answer the turns case arguments really, really quickly, because if you drop that, it's basically game over. Because if the negative wins the turns case argument, then it means that you can't solve your advantage if they win any chance of the disadvantage. If the negative wins turns case, then if they win the thesis of the DA, like the pieces of it, then they will always win that the DA outweighs the AF, because you can now no longer solve your AF. I.e., if the AF happens, it triggers the disadvantage link. That triggers something that causes the AF's impacts to occur anyways, so you can't solve them. And then once you've done that, I think you should pick 1 or 2 2AC arguments to just kind of go ham on. Notice my emphasis there, 1 or 2 arguments, right? The 1AR should be starting to condense. The 1AR should be starting to condense. And then you remember how I said how arguments get extended by the negative? You kind of do, you try and do the same thing in the 1AR here. You're time pressed, you may not have the ability to do all of those pieces, but you want to, at the very least in the 1AR, be reading new cards on the things that you are extending, because you need to be able to get back into that conversation about the card war, right? I said before, disads oftentimes become card wars, so keeping that in mind also as the affirmative is important. I tend to recommend that the 1AR extend impact defense and then a piece of 2AC offense, or whatever the best 2AC argument is. That may not be offense. It oftentimes is offense, but it may not be. But the idea is, you know, pick the strategy that the 2AR wants to go for, add something else to it, right? So you can kind of mess with the 2N's head just a bit, right? Try and confuse them, trick them a little bit, and then, you know, do it, right? Read more cards. Cards are great. We love cards. Someone asked, do impacts have to be AF specific, or can you just use generic nuclear war, XYZ impact cards? So yes, impact cards are almost always going to talk about nuclear war or extinction in some sense. You want the link and the internal link to be as much about the affirmative as you can, but the impact cards, you know, don't have to be about the AF nonsense. Okay, moving on to the 2AR. The first thing you want to do here, again, I've said this a couple times, start with the case outweighs argument, and then you want to kind of tell the story. What I mean by that is really that Your job as the 2A is to prove that the case impact is more likely or just matters more than the DA impact in some sense. And so you want to kind of weave that into your ability to tell a story to the judge. And that needs to be based on things that are said in the debates and kind of arguments that people have said. So remember, most disads make almost no sense, especially in terms of this topic. So the politics disadvantage since Trump has gotten elected has been almost universally terrible, just awful, has made so little sense. The elections disadvantage, like I said before, the idea that a criminal justice reform could just dramatically swing the election and mean that people are suddenly going to vote for Donald Trump in reality is just kind of absurd. Federalism is in reality dead, just like not a thing that really matters all that much. Spending is like, how much money do we think we spend and why do we think that that actually negatively affects the economy or hegemony or whatever the impact is? Like, in reality, all of these DAs are so silly, just like so just bafflingly stupid. And so your job as the 2AR is to exploit that, right? And you as the 2A can do that because you are giving the final speech, right? The trick to the 2AR is that it is the last speech. And so you get to stand up and kind of wax poetics about how awesome and important your affirmative is, while the disadvantage that they're talking about is not very important, just like does not matter at all. And so obviously you need to do that in the context of line by line. You need to do that in the context of arguments that you have advanced that I've said in the 1AR, and do that in a way that responds to what the 2NR has said. But just remember as the AF that you're almost definitely on the side of truth. Someone has asked, to tell the story in the 2AC, would pushing on probability of a nuclear war impact be a good choice in comparing the impacts of the AF? Possibly. To just say nuclear war broadly is probably too generic. It's about you want to make it about a particular nuclear war impact, whatever your impact is versus the disadvantages impacts. But talking about probability is one way of going about this. Yes. Do we have other questions so far? There are no other questions so far. Okay. I want to talk for a little bit about, yes, I was asked to repeat the 2AC order. I'll do that real quick. For the 2AC, number 1, case outweighs. Number 2, impact defense. Number 3 is your offense, so either a link turn or an impact turn. Number 4 is your internal link takeout, so your internal link defense. Number 5 is your uniqueness defense or uniqueness takeout. Number 6 is your link defense. And then number 7, if you want it, it's not required, is to have an add-on. Yes, you're welcome. Other questions? Yeah, Daniel.
So kind of two. One, could you say the thing about line by lines again? Like there were 7 things.
Yeah. So the way you want to do line by line is like this. Number 1 is reference what the other team is saying. So they say X, where X is the argument they've said. So they say Trump wins the election. They say you can't predict the election, whatever. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, but here's our claim, right? Here's the thing that we think is true in response, right? So they say Trump wins the election, but actually Biden will win the election, right? Our claim. Number 3 is your warrant. Why do you think that claim is true? Number 4 is your author, so reference a piece of 1NC evidence. And I think you should always be referencing a piece of 1NC, or sorry, this is me assuming you're negative again, by the way. I think you should always be referencing a card that has been read earlier in the debate, even if that card may not actually be the most on-point response to an argument that the other team has said, just because I think it's more persuasive to attach a piece of evidence to an argument than it is to not have a piece of evidence. So make sure you're citing an author here. So that was number 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 5 is impacting. And by impacting, I mean, why does it matter for the purpose of the debate? I don't mean impacting in terms of this means it causes nuclear war, but who cares about this, right? So who cares if you win uniqueness on the DA? Who cares if you win this link argument on the DA? And honestly, that is a little bit, it might feel a little bit redundant, but I think it's important to remind your judge of it, because oftentimes the judge doesn't quite understand things in the same way that you are. So have that impact there. And then number 6, evidence comparison, right? Why should we trust the card that you have said answers this argument versus their card? Explain this argument. And then that was number 6. I might have said 7. That was number 6. Number 7 is to read more cards. That makes sense, Daniel?
Yeah, it's really great. Thanks so much. And also, I wanted to ask about the case turns a bit more with DAs. Like, I don't know, how would you turn their case?
Yeah, so DA turns case, these arguments are really just the idea that some part of the disadvantage means that the affirmative's impact will happen anyways. So you might say something like, so let's pretend you're reading the elections disadvantage against the cartel's advantage from the starter packet, right? The cartel's advantage is about WMD terrorism in Mexico and Latin America broadly. You could, with the disadvantage, say, look, as climate change gets exacerbated, the state security becomes a lot weaker, and it becomes a lot easier for terrorists to then steal a nuclear weapon, right? And then they can use it, or they can more easily detonate it wherever they want to, right? And so the idea of DA turns case is just this idea that whatever some part of the disadvantage makes something that the affirmative is trying to solve way more difficult to solve. And the strategy of that becomes then, if you win this argument that the DA does turn the case, then the affirmative doesn't solve itself, right? The affirmative may stop an instance of nuclear terrorism resulting from cartels, but if something else is going to cause nuclear terrorism anyways, and we've all agreed that nuclear terrorism causes extinction, then why should I vote F? The F doesn't stop the terminal impact. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So when plan happens, it goes to the DA link, and then their impacts happen, right?
Yep, basically.
Right. Thank you.
And your DA might turn the case in different ways. Like the example I just gave is about the impact turning the affirmative, but it's possible that like a link argument could turn the affirmative. So like with the elections disadvantage, if the plan means that Trump wins, it also might mean that the GOP would win a bunch of other smaller races, and that might matter for policing, right? It might mean that the GOP, that might mean that like communities and states decide to institute more policing policies that would mean that the affirmative is less effective or something like that. But yeah, having DA turns case arguments are really important, I think. Can I explain add-ons more? Yes, add-ons are just short, like mini advantages. And by that I mean they're usually like 2 to 3 cards. They're not very long, and they're used to just say that the affirmative outweighs, right? The reason why I think they're last in the order is because you've already got an affirmative outweighs argument. You've already read the 1AC. You've advanced an affirmative that you think is good, probably, right? Since you're reading it and defending it. But they can be really strategic if you use them correctly. But yeah, it's just another reason why the AF really matters.
Okay, thank you.
Someone asks, when doing line by line on the negative, will there ever be a situation in which you would need to read another card to prop up an argument? Yes, you should always be reading more cards. Yes, that's the last part of line by line. Okay. Another question, how do we defend the silliness of disads? That is a very good question. So kind of 2 ways to go about this is, number 1, I'm going to say, yeah, we'll say 2 ways. Number 1, more cards. More cards, more cards, more cards. Expert testimony will definitely strengthen your argument, right? Like we talked about this a little bit with my lecture yesterday when we were talking about the ad verecundium, right? Appeal to authority, right? You don't ever want to just stop and be like, we've read a card from an expert, therefore we're right. But rather, your experts will have thought about and walked through what these arguments and what these internal links and these pieces look like in a much more intelligent and complex way than any of us possibly could. And that's not to say that like you all are stupid or anything like that, but it is to say that like, you know, you haven't spent the past 10 or 15 years thinking about how it is possible for a terrorist to get a nuclear weapon, like some of these impact authors do. Right. And so those people have sat and thought, okay, what are all of the possible contingencies? What are all of the possible ways that things could occur and how does it happen? So really, when you introduce those ideas and you can then rely on them in the debate to say, no, actually, this is not really very silly. It's actually really smart. And here's why it's really smart. And here's why this makes a lot of sense. Right. Debate, ultimately, remember, is a persuasive activity. It's about persuading your judge. And, you know, one of the ways primary way we do that is by reading a bunch of cards. So that's one of the ways you go about dealing with the silliness of the disadvantage. Another way is to remember your 2&R should never just have a disadvantage, right? Your 2&R will never just be 5 minutes on the disadvantage. Rather, it's going to have either case arguments or a counter plan or both case and counter plan. And so you can rely on those other positions to say that the affirmative is also quite silly, right? It may honestly come down to, it almost like, you should never literally say this in the debate, but it basically may come down to, well, the disab might be silly, but the af is silly. Right, so that is kind of another way of thinking about it, is like get good at case, get good at your counter plan, whatever it is that you want to go for.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Wait, sorry, another question. So you said at the end of the line by line, you said to read more cards.
Yes.
What kind of cards do we read for those cards?
Cards that are from experts, which answer the other team's argument.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. Other questions?
Also, real quick, I missed this. For the line by line, what was the 6th item again?
Sorry, let me scroll over to my notes.
Evidence comparison.
Yes, evidence comparison. And by that I just mean, tell me why we should prefer your piece of evidence over their piece of evidence. Okay, sorry, give me one sec here. Last thing I want to talk about are likely disadvantages this year. I'll try and walk you through them a little bit, but like I've stressed a couple times throughout this lecture, it really is slim picking, and you should probably prioritize having the counter plan or your case arguments in the 2&R. I like to think of disadvantages as falling into one of two categories. So there's either the process disadvantage, which is about the process of the AF, and then there's the topic disadvantages, which I tend to think are more about the the topic itself or about the action of the affirmative. Those are not like hard and fast categories. Like I think there are disads that could be both process and topic, or it might not really fall in either, but I think that's a good kind of schematic for thinking about types of disads. So in terms of the process disadvantages on this topic, we've obviously got the elections disadvantage, right? That's coming up very soon now, and there is an argument that criminal justice reform might swing that election. Our cards at the GDS are like shockingly good on this. I'm pretty surprised how good they are, honestly. Politics disadvantages, the link argument is very, very strong here. Like people in a primarily conservative Congress do not really like criminal justice reform generally, and so there's definitely a strong link argument. Federalism is going to be a pretty common disadvantage, right? That the idea is that criminal justice reform should be done at the state level, and then when the federal government tries to do criminal justice reform, it kind of takes away the state's ability to do that, and that might be problematic for that division of power. In terms of other processy things, court clog disadvantage, Michigan 7-week is working on this, so there are other camps that are doing it. It only really makes sense against a court's affirmative. It says that whatever the affirmative does, it mandates the Supreme Court does some kind of ruling on it. That would then slow down and kind of gum up courts, which means that they then can't pass other cool decrees, or it means their decisions on other debates are kind of delayed, and that might be problematic for some reason. That might matter in terms of like Roe v. Wade, which I know that Cal's camp is talking about right now. And then the other kind of processy DA that I was thinking about is movements disadvantage, which I think Will talked about a little bit with you all in the topic lecture. I might be wrong, but the idea is that there are broad social movements right now that are fighting for massive change. And when the affirmative kind of gives kind of a weaker, smaller instance of those change, it kind of sedates those movements and means that they kind of lose their oomph, their like effort, their ability to garner support, which then means that those movements don't effectively pass whatever kind of change they think is necessary, and that change is good for some reason. I think the kind of more topic-specific version of this is about what I'm going to call the comprehensive reform disadvantage, which is just like there will be very, very large criminal justice reforms happening now. If the affirmative happens, it's kind of a small reform that saps effort, political capital, or I don't know, interest, whatever word you want to use, for those kinds of comprehensive reforms, which then means those comprehensive reforms don't happen, and those are really good for some reason. I could see a world where someone reads like a policing disadvantage or like a crime DA that's just like, look, when we try and reform criminal justice, it weakens our ability to fight crime, or like the police are good or something like that. But like, first of all, that you need some kind of spillover argument, right? You need to be able to say that, you know, whatever the affirmative does actually does affect the criminal justice system broadly, instead of just like the little piece of it, which like, I don't know. I imagine those cards are not super easy to find. Second concern is like, yikes. You know, any of you have been watching the news or reading anything on the internet, you know that there are obviously massive protests right now against the police. And so getting into that position where you're saying the police are good is maybe a tough one, I will say. A spending disad is also possible, right? Whatever these affirmatives are probably require an increase in spending, and that might be problematic for some reason. But like I kind of said before, I think that's kind of weak. Like, federal government's already massively deficit spending. I don't know what an extra 100 million or whatever, 10, I don't know how much these affirmatives would cost. Probably not enough to radically change how things work, but I don't know, maybe you could win that. And then there are probably going to be DAs to particular asks. So the first one that I thought about was if someone tries to legalize marijuana, you could say that that would weaken cartels, which would be a bad thing for regional stability in Mexico or in Latin America, and just kind of say the opposite of what our current app is. But again, it's not great. If you really want to go for DAs, I think the best ones are probably elections and maybe this comprehensive reform argument, and then federalism. But going for those things with a counterplan would make things way easier. And going for that 2-in-R strategy that prioritizes the counterplan over the DA would really be the good move on this topic, I think. Someone asks if you can still do court acts because of the definition of enact. I think you're probably right that enact likely means court acts are not T, but I would bet that someone's still going to read a courts app anyways, and so having a DA ready is not a bad idea. Daniel, yeah.
What do you think we should read against KFs to see?
That is an entirely separate conversation.
All right.
Yeah. If they're non-topical, framework are okay. Yeah, Max.
Wait, can you explain the movement DA again?
So the movements DA says that there are broad movements, like social movements, that will eventually go and change how the government works. But the affirmative kind of sedates those movements by giving them like a little bit of what they want, right? It gives some kind of criminal justice reform, which then means that the people in the movements are like, look, we've won, everything's okay, we don't need to support this movement anymore, which then means that the movement dies. The problem is that what the movement was going to actually cause, what kind of change it was going to actually cause, would be a lot stronger and a lot more effective or a lot more important than the small reform that the affirmative is causing. And so then the affirmative is a bad idea because within its kind of particular reform, it trades off with a broader reform. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Yeah. Someone asked if I can think of specific disadds to forensic science reforms. Oh, that is a tough one. Honestly, all I can think of are about the yeah, I'm gonna say I'm not entirely sure. I won't lie. I'm sure that those disadds exist, but if they do exist, I'm gonna guess they're not that great. Sorry that I cannot be more helpful than that. You're welcome. Okay, that, I mean, is the end of my lecture, so I am happy to answer any and every other question that has to do with disadvantages. I did all different speaker positions, but that also has nothing to do with disadds, so also nothing to do with disadds. Questions about the lecture, please. Do I think that some sort of police backlash disadd would be viable? I think that it probably depends on what the affirmative is. I think it theoretically could be a possible, like, it could theoretically be viable, but I think that generally speaking, it is going to be less viable because given the kind of political atmosphere resulting from you know, the large-scale demonstrations and protests over the summer, I think that it becomes a lot easier for the affirmative to say, no, the police are awful and you can't defend them. Is the comprehensive reform DA the only topic type of DA? No, the other topic type of DAs that I have here are the policing DA, which someone else just asked about, the spending disadd, and then disadds that are about particular affirmatives. So the example I had given for that was that legalizing marijuana might weaken cartels, which could be bad for regional stability in Latin America or something like that. Daniel.
Do you think this year a better strategy would be, like, instead of reading any case, just running like 3 or 4 off?
That
like
depends.
3 or 4 DAs, like.
I mean, I think you should read DAs in the 1 and C, yes. I think if you want to go for the DA in the 2 and R, you should probably have a counterplan with it in this instant, in this year.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So someone has asked, could there be a DA that says reducing number of prisons would hurt the economy? That is a possibility. Like there is a very massive economy or economic industry based around the prison. We call it the prison industrial complex. So there is a possibility for a disadvantage. Again, that gets you into the same problem with reading the policing disadvantage, which is just like, you know, a lot of way that people are treated in prison is pretty terrible. And, you know, the massively expanding prison industrial complex in this country is just like not so great. So, you know, it's dicey. It would be very, very difficult, I think, to defend prison's good DA, which is, I guess, maybe I think I alluded to this, maybe to not explicitly say it before, is that part of the problem with the disadds this year is that the kind of topic disadvantages oftentimes will fall into this category of, yikes, that is basically indefensible. right? Like police good, prison's good, real tough. Yeah, two different types of DAs that I talked about are process DAs and topic DAs. Again, not like set in stone. I'm sure you can think of examples of disads that don't fall into that category or disads that do fall into both of those categories, but I think it's a good way to conceptualize how DAs look. Someone asked if it makes sense to read a movements DA with a K. Yes, I think it could make sense. You could just read the movements DA by itself, but reading it with, just like reading a DA with a counterplan this year is going to make more sense. Reading a DA or reading that DA with a K in line with it would make more sense. How long does the 2AR spent on the disad depends entirely on 2AR strategy and what happens in the 2NR. So I can't really give you an exact answer. But you want to remember the goal of the point of the 2AR is, since you have the last speech, is to really like wax poetics, prove that your affirmative really matters, and that's just more important than the disadvantage. So whatever you need to do that. If the neg runs 6 off and you don't address the impact of the disad and the 2AC, how do you recover? So I will say that you don't absolutely need to have impact events in order to beat back a DA. Like I kind of said before earlier in this lecture, if the affirmative wins any one part of the disadvantage, right, the uniqueness link impact, or uniqueness link internal link impact, terminal impact, then the affirmative should win against the disadvantage. So you could get away with not having impact events as the F. Although truthfully, like, I think this is not universally true, but I think a lot of judges are more comfortable with the 1AR, just you could read an impact defense card and just be like, no, we totally had an impact defense argument in the 2AC. I don't know, it is brand new in that instance in the 1AR, but if you think you're going to lose because you don't have impact defense, then you might as well do it, because what's the worst that happens at that point? Someone else has asked how we should keep up with politics DA research. You want to try and figure out, what people are talking about, what is kind of top of the docket is what we say. Given the way that the current administration and the current Congress works, I think it's not always, generally safe to say that there is not more than one, maybe two things being debated at a particular time. And so I actually think it's not that difficult to really keep up with how politics changes right now. And so, I don't know, read the news. Yes, the elections DA will no longer be relevant after the election.